The summer sun blazed over Riverside Park in Columbus, Ohio, as 3-year-old Emma giggled while chasing butterflies. Her mother, Maria, watched from a nearby bench, sipping lemonade. In seconds, everything shattered. It was Tuesday, June 15th, a day that had started like any other summer afternoon. Maria had packed a small cooler with sandwiches, juice boxes, and homemade tamales, Emma's favorite, hopping for a peaceful afternoon at the park. She'd been cooped up in their small apartment all morning, while the air conditioning struggled against the brutal Columbus heat. Emma, energetic and spirited as always, had practically vibrated with excitement when Maria announced their destination. "Park, Mama, park," Emma had asked repeatedly during their short drive, her small voice filled with anticipation. Her dark curls bounced as she nodded enthusiastically, barely able to contain herself until they pulled into the parking lot. By 2:47 p.m., they'd been at Riverside Park for exactly 40 minutes. Maria sat on a green bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, positioning herself strategically so she could see Emma while maintaining a comfortable distance. She'd learned that 3-year-olds needed room to explore, to feel independent, yet parents couldn't afford to look away for more than a few seconds. It was a delicate balance, one that most mothers understood instinctively. Emma wore her favorite outfit, a pink sundress with little butterfly embroidered patterns scattered across the fabric, as if the universe had known she'd become obsessed with chasing them. Her light-up sneakers, which Emma called her magic shoes, clicked against the playground equipment as she climbed and jumped with the fearlessness of someone who'd never experienced real pain. "Mama, look at me, look," Emma called out repeatedly, her voice cutting through the ambient park sounds, other children laughing, dogs barking in the distance, the distant hum of traffic from the nearby street. "I'm watching, I'm watching," Maria called back, her voice warm with maternal pride. She'd been scrolling through her phone, checking messages from her husband Carlos, who was at work, but she looked up each time Emma demanded her attention. Mostly, though, she was present, engaged, the kind of mother who believed in both supervision and freedom. The park that afternoon was moderately busy. A group of teenagers played basketball on the concrete courts to the far left, their shouts and competitive banter creating a rhythmic soundtrack. An elderly couple walked the perimeter path, hand in hand. A man was throwing a frisbee for his golden retriever near the open field. It was an ordinary Tuesday, filled with the ordinary joys of summer. Emma had grown bored with the playground equipment around 3:15 p.m. and had wandered toward the basketball courts, drawn by the sound of the teenagers' competitive laughter and the bouncing of the ball. Maria had noted the direction but wasn't alarmed. The courts were only about 60 feet away, and the path was clear with good. She could see Emma's pink dress moving between the playground and the court area. "Stay where Mama can see you," she'd called out, and Emma had waved without turning around, too fascinated by the older kids to acknowledge her mother properly. That's when the delivery truck had pulled into the small parking lot adjacent to the basketball courts. The truck was a standard commercial vehicle, white with faded lettering on the side advertising a local home goods delivery company. It wasn't particularly large or threatening, nothing that should have seemed dangerous. The driver, a man in his 50s named James, had been making deliveries all day in the summer heat. He was tired, cranky from the traffic, and eager to finish his route before 5 p.m. Had pulled into the lot and stopped the truck near the small recreation center building. According to his delivery schedule, he needed to drop off supplies for the summer camps that operated from the center. He'd done this route dozens of times before without incident. The parking lot was familiar, predictable, routine. He put the truck in reverse. Maria had been looking at her phone when she heard it, a sound she would later describe to police as a sort of beeping noise, but distant. It was the truck's backup alarm, the standard warning system designed to alert anyone in the vehicle's path, but Maria hadn't processed the sound as a threat. Delivery trucks were always coming and going from the park's various facilities. The beeping was ambient noise, part of the soundscape she'd learned to filter out while remaining alert to Emma's movements. Emma, still entranced by the teenagers and their basketball game, had wandered just slightly further toward the parking lot. She was chasing a butterfly, an actual monarch butterfly with brilliant orange and black wings, and in that way that children have of becoming utterly consumed by a single pursuit, she wasn't paying attention to her surroundings. The butterfly had fluttered low, just at the edge of the parking lot's perimeter, and Emma had followed it without hesitation. James hadn't seen her. He'd checked his mirrors as he always did, glancing left and right before putting the truck in reverse. He'd been making deliveries for over 20 years without a single incident. He considered himself a safe driver, cautious and professional. He saw nothing in his mirror that suggested danger. What he couldn't see was a 3-year-old girl in a pink butterfly dress, moving into his blind spot, completely absorbed by an insect. The truck began reversing slowly, carefully, navigating by feel and experience. He'd cleared about 6 feet when he felt something. It was subtle at first, a slight resistance, a feeling he would later struggle to describe to investigators. His foot was on the brake, but something had changed in the truck's movement. He stopped immediately, confusion crossing his face. Then he heard it, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A small child's scream, high-pitched and filled with panic. His heart stopped. He knew, without even getting out of the truck, that something terrible had happened. His hands began shaking as he shifted to park and threw open the driver's side door. What he saw would be etched into his nightmares forever. Little Emma lay crumpled beneath the right rear wheel of the truck, her small body at an impossible angle. Her pink butterfly dress was torn, stained with blood. One of her light-up magic shoes had come off and lay several feet away. Her tiny face was contorted in agony, and she was screaming, a sound of pure, primal pain that transcended language. Maria's scream came a fraction of a second later, a mother's primal shriek that cut through the summer afternoon with terrifying clarity. She'd seen it happen. She'd seen her daughter disappear beneath the truck, had heard the sickening crunch of impact, had felt her entire world collapse in the space of a single breath. She ran toward Emma, her cooler of sandwiches and juice boxes forgotten on the bench, her phone falling from her hand. Time seemed to fragment into surreal moments, her feet pounding the pavement, her voice calling Emma's name over and over, the teenagers at the basketball courts freezing mid-game, the elderly couple abandoning their walk and hurrying over. James stood frozen beside his truck, his face gone white, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. He kept saying the same thing over and over. I didn't see her. I didn't see her. I didn't see her. Someone called 911. Several people called 911. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. A park maintenance worker who'd been nearby performed basic first aid, gently positioning Emma to protect her airway while avoiding moving her injured leg unnecessarily. Emma's screams had given way to whimpers, and then to silence. Not peaceful silence, but the shocked silence of a child in severe pain and trauma, her tiny body shutting down as a protection mechanism. Maria held her daughter's small hand, whispering desperately, "You're going to be okay, baby. You're going to be okay. Mama's here. Mama's here." But nothing would ever be quite okay again. 3 agonizing months passed. Emma stopped speaking entirely. Not a single word escaped her lips. No mama, no dada, nothing. She stared blankly at cartoons, refused to eat, and woke screaming from nightmares at 3 a.m. every night. Doctors diagnosed severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Her father Carlos held his daughter while she trembled, feeling powerless. Therapists tried everything: play therapy, art therapy, gentle conversations. But Emma remained locked in her personal prison. Then came the crushing blow. Prosecutors needed Emma to testify in court. A traumatized 3-year-old would be the cases. Judge Martinez scheduled a hearing to determine if Emma could even testify. The family faced an impossible choice: force their daughter to relive her nightmare, or let the negligent driver walk free. The Columbus Children's Hospital had become Emma's second home. For the first 2 weeks following the accident, she'd remained there, her small body wrapped in bandages and casts, monitors beeping continuously around her hospital bed. The left leg that had been crushed beneath the truck's wheel was now encased in a bright blue cast that extended from her hip to her toes. Surgeons had performed 2 operations to repair the shattered bones, pin the fractures, and assess the damage to the soft tissue. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. With time and physical therapy, they believed Emma would walk normally again. But the physical injuries were merely the visible wounds. Maria had barely left Emma's hospital room during those initial weeks. She'd slept in the uncomfortable reclining chair beside her daughter's bed, holding her small hand through the night, whispering prayers she hadn't prayed since childhood. Carlos had tried to spell her, insisting she go home to shower and sleep in an actual bed, but Maria had refused most of his attempts. This was her daughter, her baby, and she would not abandon her for a single moment longer than necessary. On the 7th day of Emma's hospitalization, the social worker, a kind-faced woman named, had gently broached the subject of psychological support. "Emma is showing signs of severe anxiety and shock," explained, sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from Maria's recliner. "The physical wounds will heal, Mrs., but the psychological trauma may take much longer. We recommend immediate counseling with a pediatric therapist who specializes in trauma." Maria had nodded numbly, accepting the referral. What choice did she have? If therapy could help her daughter, she would pursue it with the ferocity of a mother protecting her young. When Emma was finally discharged after 3 weeks, she came home in a wheelchair, her leg still in its blue cast, her eyes hollow and distant. The apartment that had once echoed with her laughter and constant chatter felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if the space itself had absorbed the family's trauma. That's when Maria first noticed that Emma wasn't speaking. It wasn't that Emma was being silent as a choice. Toddlers go through phases of quietness. This was different. This was the absence of sound that should have been there. Emma didn't call for her mother when she needed something. She didn't ask for juice or her favorite stuffed animal. She didn't respond when her father came home from work and bent down to kiss her forehead. "Emma, baby, tell Daddy about your day," Carlos had said that first evening home, his voice bright and artificially cheerful as he sat beside her wheelchair in their living room. Emma had stared at the television screen, where a cartoon played on mute. She hadn't turned her head. She hadn't acknowledged his presence in any way. Maria and Carlos exchanged worried glances. When Maria gently touched Emma's chin and turned her head to face her, Emma's eyes were unfocused, looking through her mother rather than at her. It was as if Emma had retreated so far into herself that the outside world no longer had any claim on her consciousness. The first pediatric psychologist they consulted was Doctor, no relation to the truck driver, though the coincidence had made both parents wince. Doctor was experienced and gentle, but after 3 sessions with Emma, he delivered a diagnosis that sent chills down their spines. Selective mutism in conjunction with acute post-traumatic stress disorder. Your daughter has experienced severe psychological shock. Her brain is protecting itself the only way it knows how, by shutting down verbal communication. "Will she speak again?" Maria had asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Typically, yes," Doctor had replied carefully, "but we cannot predict a timeline. Some children recover within weeks, others take months or even years. Each child's trauma response is unique." Months. The word had echoed in Maria's mind like a prison sentence. The second month of Emma's silence was perhaps the darkest. The novelty of her injury had worn off. Concerned relatives stopped calling as frequently. Friends who had initially flooded their inbox with prayers and offers of support had gradually retreated to their own lives. The apartment felt increasingly isolated, a bubble of pain that no one else quite knew how to navigate. Emma's night terrors were relentless. Almost every evening between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., She would wake up screaming, a sound so primal and anguished that it seemed to come from the depths of her small soul. She would claw at the air, her tiny fists flailing, her mouth opening in that silent scream that had become her signature of suffering. She seemed to be reliving the moment of impact over and over, her body remembering what her mind was refusing to process. Carlos would hold her as she trembled, whispering reassurances that seemed to bounce off an invisible wall between them and his daughter. "You're safe. You're home. Daddy's here. You're safe." But Emma didn't feel safe. Her body had learned that safety was an illusion, that at any moment without warning, the world could crush you beneath its massive wheels. Physical therapy began in the 3rd month, and Emma participated mechanically, her small face blank with emotional distance as she performed the exercises designed to restore strength to her damaged leg. Her physical therapist, Tom, was an enthusiastic man who worked with injured children regularly, but even he seemed baffled by the depth of Emma's psychological withdrawal. "Physically, she's progressing well," Tom had told the parents during a progress meeting. "But there's no engagement, no spark. It's like she's going through the motions on autopilot. The psychological piece is really the limiting factor here." By the end of the 3rd month, the cast came off. Emma's leg, though thin and pale from weeks of immobility, was structurally healed. The visible wound had closed, but nothing else had changed. Emma still didn't speak. She still had nightmares. She'd begun refusing food, not dramatically but passively. When food was placed in front of her, she would look at it blankly until an adult removed it. Maria had lost 15 pounds. Dark circles had become permanent fixtures under her eyes. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job at the hospital where she worked as a billing coordinator, unable to focus on anything beyond her daughter's suffering. It was during this 3rd month that the lawyer had called. The district attorney's office was building their case against James. The physical evidence was solid: expert analysis of the truck's positioning, visibility studies showing the blind spot where Emma had been standing, witness testimonies from park visitors who'd seen the accident unfold. But there was one element that would cement the case: the victim's own testimony. "They want Emma to testify," Carlos had told Maria after hanging up the phone, his voice hollow. "They say a jury needs to hear from her about what happened, about her injuries, about the impact this has had on her life." Maria had felt the room spin. "But she can't even speak, Carlos. She hasn't said a word in 3 months. How can she possibly testify?" That was when the impossible conversation had begun. The prosecutor had suggested that Emma might be competent to testify despite her selective mutism, that she could point, nod, shake her head, communicate through other means. But the legal team had also warned them that without verbal testimony, the case would be significantly weakened. "Your daughter is the key witness," the prosecutor had said gently. "We can move forward without her, but her presence, her account of that day, it would be transformative." The family had been handed an impossible choice: push their damaged daughter to relive her trauma in a courtroom full of strangers, or let the man who'd crushed her beneath his truck potentially escape with minimal consequences. Neither option felt survivable. Detective Sarah sat in her unmarked police car outside the courthouse, reviewing Emma's file for the 100th time. She'd seen too many cases fail because traumatized children couldn't testify, but she'd also seen something miraculous: the healing power of K9 units. Sarah worked with Luna, a stunning German shepherd trained in trauma support for victims. Luna had helped dozens of traumatized children through impossible situations. An idea struck her like lightning. What if Luna attended Emma's testimony? Sarah's colleagues thought she was crazy. Judges rarely allowed dogs in courtrooms, but Sarah prepared a comprehensive proposal with documented evidence of success rates. Judge Martinez reviewed it skeptically, then slowly nodded. She granted permission for one trial meeting. Sarah's heart raced with possibility. Detective Sarah had been with the Ohio State Police for 18 years, and in that time, she developed a reputation as someone who thought outside the box. Her fellow officers sometimes rolled their eyes at her unconventional methods, but her case closure rate spoke for itself. She was the detective who brought therapy dogs to crime scenes. She was the one who'd established the K9 Victim Support Program in the Columbus Division. And she was absolutely convinced that animals possessed a kind of healing magic that science was only beginning to understand. She'd first encountered Luna 5 years ago when the dog was in training at the police academy's specialized K9 program. Luna was different from most police dogs. While her German Shepherd siblings were being trained for detection, apprehension, and search and rescue operations, Luna was being groomed for something gentler but no less important: victim support and trauma response. Luna's trainer, Officer Sean, had explained it to Sarah during a coffee break at the academy. Luna's got this thing. She reads people's emotional states like most dogs read scent. She knows when someone is hurting, and she knows how to help them without being intrusive. She's a natural. Sarah had watched Luna work with a group of survivors from a domestic violence shelter during a demonstration. The German Shepherd moved with intentional slowness, her body language non-threatening, her eyes compassionate. When a woman who'd been severely traumatized flinched at Luna's approach, the dog simply lay down, creating a physical distance that said, "I'm here, but I'm not going to overwhelm you." Within 10 minutes, the woman had her hand on Luna's head, and for the first time in months she was smiling. That's when Sarah knew she wanted to work with Luna. For the past 4 years, Sarah and Luna had been an inseparable team. They'd visited hospitals, courthouses, victim support centers, and crime scenes. Sarah had documented Luna's effectiveness meticulously, keeping detailed records of cases where the dog's presence had made a measurable difference in trauma victims' ability to cooperate with investigators, testify in court, or simply begin the long process of healing. The statistics were compelling. 78% of child victims who worked with Luna showed measurable improvements in anxiety levels. 65% of traumatized children were able to provide more detailed and coherent testimony when accompanied by a support animal. Heart rates dropped an average of 12 beats per minute in the presence of Luna. Cortisol levels, the stress hormone, decreased significantly during interactions with her. But despite these numbers, resistance persisted. Judges were skeptical. Some prosecutors worried it would confuse juries or seem gimmicky. Law enforcement administrators questioned whether dogs belonged in formal legal proceedings. Then Sarah had read Emma's file. She'd been sent the case details through the district attorney's office, which routinely consulted with law enforcement on sensitive matters involving child witnesses. Reading through the documentation, Sarah's heart had broken progressively with each page. The accident, the physical injuries, the complete psychological shutdown, the 3 months of silence, the night terrors, the refusal to eat, the impossible choice the parents faced. And she'd thought, Luna. But Sarah wasn't naive. She knew that approaching a judge with an unconventional idea required more than enthusiasm. It required evidence, documentation, precedent, and a bulletproof proposal. She spent an entire week preparing a comprehensive presentation for Judge Martinez. Sarah compiled research studies on the efficacy of animal-assisted therapy in legal proceedings, case studies from other states where therapy dogs had successfully aided child witnesses, video testimonials from previous trauma victims who'd worked with Luna, veterinary certifications confirming Luna's temperament and training, letters of recommendation from prosecutors and judges who'd witnessed Luna's work firsthand, a detailed protocol outlining exactly how Luna would be positioned during testimony, what behaviors were trained, and contingency plans if the dog needed to be removed. Sarah had even included a section on legal precedent, citing cases from Florida, California, and New York, where court-authorized comfort animals had alongside victims. When she'd submitted the proposal to Judge Martinez's chambers, Sarah had expected either a quick rejection or, at best, a lukewarm maybe. Instead, The judge's assistant had called 3 days later. "Judge Martinez would like to meet with you and the dog," the assistant had said. "Can you come in Monday at 10 a.m.? Sarah's pulse had quickened. This was more than she dared hope for. On Monday morning, Sarah had arrived at the courthouse with Luna, both of them groomed to perfection. Sarah wore her dress uniform and Luna wore her official service vest. They'd taken the elevator up to the judge's chambers, and Sarah had felt nervous in a way she hadn't felt in years. This mattered. This could change everything for Emma. Judge Martinez was a woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everything in her field of vision simultaneously. She'd looked at Sarah, then at Luna, then back at Sarah again. "Tell me why I should allow a dog in my courtroom," the judge had said without preamble. It wasn't a hostile question, but it was direct. Sarah had taken a breath and explained. She talked about the neuroscience of trauma, about how animals could activate calming responses in the brain. She described Emma's situation specifically, a 3-year-old girl whose only chance of testifying might depend on having an anchor, a physical connection to safety. She'd shared stories of other cases where Luna had made the difference between silence and testimony. Judge Martinez had listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, the judge had stood up and extended her hand toward Luna. "May I?" the judge had asked. Sarah had nodded. Luna had approached the judge with her characteristic grace, and Judge Martinez had scratched behind her ears. The judge's severe expression had softened almost imperceptibly. "Tell me about her training," the judge had said, her hand still on Luna's head. They'd talked for 45 minutes. Sarah had demonstrated Luna's basic commands, her calm demeanor, her ability to sense emotional distress. The judge had asked intelligent questions about liability, about courtroom protocol, about what would happen if Luna became distressed or disruptive. When the meeting ended, Judge Martinez had walked them to the door. "I'm going to allow this," she'd said, "but I want to meet with the family and their daughter first. We need to ensure this is something the child is willing to participate in, not something we're imposing upon her." Sarah had left the judge's chambers feeling like she was walking on air. They'd gotten a yes, an actual yes. Luna was going to get her chance. But Sarah knew the hard part was still ahead. Emma had to agree. The traumatized child who hadn't spoken in 3 months had to somehow indicate that she wanted to work with a dog. And if that miracle occurred, then Sarah and Luna would have the opportunity to help unlock the little girl's voice. Sarah had called the family that afternoon. Maria had answered the phone, and Sarah had introduced herself, explaining her background and her proposal. There had been a long silence on the other end of the line. "You want Emma to meet with a police dog," Maria had said, her voice uncertain. "I want to give Emma a chance," Sarah had replied carefully. "Luna isn't just any dog. She's trained to help children who experience trauma. I can't promise miracles, but I can promise that Luna will do everything in her power to help your daughter feel safe enough to communicate, whether that's speaking or any other form of communication." Maria had cried during that phone call. Carlos had gotten on the extension. They'd asked dozens of questions, and Sarah had answered every one with patience and honesty. By the end of the call, they'd agreed to a meeting. The courtroom felt sterile and cold as Emma entered, limping slightly, her parents flanking her like protective shields. Judge Martinez watched carefully as Luna was led in, her golden eyes calm and intelligent. The German shepherd moved with purposeful grace, her service vest gleaming under fluorescent lights. Emma froze, fear flickering across her face. Luna didn't approach aggressively. Instead, she lay down slowly, positioning herself at Emma's eye level, completely non-threatening. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Emma's rigid shoulders began to relax, her breathing steadied. Without warning, she reached out and touched Luna's fur. "Soft," she whispered, her first word in 97 days. The courtroom erupted in barely contained emotion. Maria collapsed into Carlos's arms, sobbing. The judge wiped tears from her eyes. Luna had unlocked what therapy couldn't. The morning of the meeting had arrived with a kind of crystalline clarity. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold, the kind of June day that felt like nature itself was conspiring to create optimal conditions. Sarah had driven to the courthouse early with Luna, allowing time for the dog to acclimate to the unfamiliar environment. They'd walked the halls, let Luna sniff the corners and doorways, helped her become comfortable with the acoustics and energy of the building. Judge Martinez had arranged for them to use one of the smaller courtrooms rather than the grand main courtroom where actual trials took place. She'd believed, correctly, that a smaller, less imposing space would be less intimidating for a traumatized 3-year-old. The room was still formal, with its elevated judge's bench and wooden railings, but it was considerably less cavernous than the main courtroom. Sarah had positioned Luna on a cushioned mat in the corner of the room, giving the dog a comfortable place to rest while remaining visible. The space was arranged thoughtfully, with soft lighting and chairs positioned to create a sense of safety rather than interrogation. Judge Martinez had even arranged for a small side table with juice boxes and crackers, a subtle acknowledgement that this was a child they were dealing with, not just a witness. Maria and Carlos had arrived with Emma at precisely 10 a.m. Sarah had watched from across the room as they entered, and her heart had immediately gone out to them. Emma was thin, noticeably so, her small frame barely filling the pink sundress she wore. She moved carefully, still favoring her left leg even though the cast had been removed weeks ago. Her dark eyes were distant, unfocused, carrying the weight of trauma that no 3-year-old should ever have to bear. But it was Emma's mother who broke Sarah's heart most acutely. Maria looked hollowed out, as if 3 months of constant worry had physically excavated something essential from her being. There were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't conceal, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested she hadn't seen direct sunlight in weeks. Carlos stood close to his wife, his hand on the small of her back, a gesture that seemed more about holding her up than offering comfort. Judge Martinez had greeted them warmly, her judicial demeanor softening into something more maternal and reassuring. "Welcome, Emma. Welcome, Maria and Carlos. I'm Judge Martinez. We're so glad you could come visit us today. We have a special friend we'd like you to meet. Her name is Luna and she's a police dog. She's very gentle and very kind. Would you like to say hello to her?" Emma had looked at her mother uncertainly. Maria had squeezed her daughter's hand gently and nodded encouragement, though Sarah could see the fear in the mother's eyes, fear that this would upset Emma further, that introducing her to a large dog might exacerbate her trauma rather than alleviate it. Sarah had remained quiet and still, allowing Judge Martinez to do the talking. She'd learned through years of working with traumatized individuals that silence was often more powerful than explanation. Luna, for her part, had remained perfectly still on her mat, her body language completely open and non-threatening. Emma had taken a tentative step forward, then stopped. Maria had walked with her, Carlos remaining slightly behind. They'd approached Luna slowly, with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested they were approaching a dangerous wild animal rather than a domesticated police dog. Then something remarkable had happened. Luna had shifted her position but not to approach Emma. Instead, the dog had laid her head down on her paws, effectively making herself smaller, less imposing. Her golden eyes, intelligent and impossibly kind, had tracked Emma's movement, but her body language communicated absolute non-aggression. It was in understanding what a traumatized child needed: space, agency, and the opportunity to approach on her own terms. Emma had stopped about 3 feet away from Luna. She'd stared at the dog for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, with the kind of tentative bravery that suggested she was doing something she both wanted and feared, Emma had taken one more step forward. "Hi, Luna," Emma had whispered. Sarah had felt tears prickle her eyes. Those 2 words, the first words Emma had spoken in 97 days, had been barely audible, but they'd echoed through the courtroom like a clarion call. Maria had made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Carlos had wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, holding her as she began to weep with the kind of intensity that suggested months of held tension suddenly finding release. Judge Martinez had remained composed, but Sarah could see the moisture in the judge's eyes. Emma had taken another small step, and this time she'd reached out her hand toward Luna's fur. The dog's coat was soft and well-maintained, and Emma's small fingers had made contact with the German shepherd's shoulder. "Soft," Emma had said, this time with slightly more confidence in her voice. Luna had not moved. She'd simply allowed Emma to touch her, to make contact, to establish a connection. After a few moments of this gentle contact, Luna had lifted her head slightly and had very gently pressed her nose against Emma's small hand, a gesture of greeting that was entirely Luna's own initiative. And then something extraordinary had occurred. Emma had not pulled away. Instead, she'd begun stroking Luna's head with both hands, her small fingers working through the dog's fur with increasing confidence. And as she touched the dog, something had shifted in her posture. Her rigid shoulders had begun to relax. The tension that had characterized her entire body for 3 months had started to dissolve. For the next 40 minutes, Emma had remained in contact with Luna. She'd sat down on the floor beside the dog, carefully, favoring her still weak left leg, and had rested her small body against Luna's side. She'd whispered a few more words. "Good girl, pretty dog, soft fur." They were the kinds of simple observations a young child makes, but they were words. They were proof that Emma's voice still existed somewhere deep inside, waiting for the right key to unlock it. Judge Martinez had watched the entire interaction without speaking. Sarah had observed the judge observing, and she'd recognized the exact moment when the judge had understood. This dog could work. This dog could help this child do something that months of therapy, medication, and professional intervention had failed to accomplish. Near the end of the session, Maria had approached Sarah quietly while Emma continued stroking Luna. "What is this?" Maria had asked, her voice thick with emotion. "What's happening to my daughter?" Sarah had explained about oxytocin, about how animals could activate the parasympathetic nervous system, about the neurochemistry of connection and safety. But she'd also been honest about the limits of what she knew. "I can tell you that Luna seems to have formed a connection with Emma," Sarah had said carefully. "Whether that connection can be sustained, whether it can help Emma testify in court, that remains to be seen. But what I can tell you is that your daughter spoke today. For the first time in 3 months, Emma used her voice. Luna gave her a reason to." When it had come time to leave, Emma had hugged Luna, actually hugged the dog, wrapping her small arms around the dog's neck. She'd whispered something into Luna's ear that only the dog could hear. As the family had left the courthouse, Emma had turned back multiple times to look at Luna, a light in her eyes that had been absent for far too long. Judge Martinez had pulled Sarah aside after they'd left. "When can you bring Luna back?" the judge had asked. "Because I think we just witnessed something important, something that might just give us hope." Sarah had smiled, her eyes still glistening with tears. "We can bring her back as soon as you'd like, Your Honor. Emma and Luna have just begun their work together, and I have a feeling this is only the beginning." Over 14 intense days, Emma and Luna met in private sessions designed by psychologists. Each time Emma spoke more. She whispered about the truck, the terrible sound, the pain, the fear that still haunted her nights. Luna remained perfectly still, absorbing every word with uncanny understanding. Remarkably, Emma's vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, stayed calm during these sessions. Previous therapies had spiked her stress levels dangerously. But with Luna, something shifted. Emma began having fewer nightmares. She started eating again. Color returned to her pale cheeks. Even her walk improved, less limping, more confidence. The transformation was undeniable. Judge Martinez officially approved Luna's presence during courtroom testimony. The stage was set for something unprecedented. The first follow-up session occurred just 3 days after that initial courtroom meeting. This time, Sarah and Luna were ushered into a specialized room at Columbus Children's Hospital that had been specifically designed for therapeutic work with trauma victims. The space was nothing like a traditional office or courtroom. Instead, it resembled a comfortable living room, soft lighting, cushioned chairs, warm colors on the walls, a small area rug, and toys scattered thoughtfully around the space. Dr. Santos, a pediatric trauma psychologist with 15 years of experience, was waiting when they arrived. Dr. Santos had been skeptical when Judge Martinez had first broached the idea of animal-assisted therapy during Emma's testimony. But after witnessing the initial meeting between Emma and Luna, she'd become an ardent believer. "I've been reading the research all night," Dr. Santos had confessed to Sarah that morning. "And I have to admit, I was wrong to be dismissive. The data on animal-assisted therapy with trauma victims is remarkable. The question is, can we measure and document Emma's progress in a way that will be scientifically valid and legally defensible?" That was precisely what these sessions were designed to accomplish. When Emma arrived with Maria and Carlos, Sarah immediately noticed the difference in the child's demeanor. Emma was still quiet, still cautious, but there was a spark of anticipation in her eyes that hadn't been present before. She looked for Luna before even looking at her parents. "Luna's here?" Emma had asked, her voice small but distinctly more present than it had been during their first meeting. "Luna's here," Sarah had confirmed, trying to keep her voice neutral even as joy coursed through her. "She's been thinking about you." Dr. Santos had Emma sit in a comfortable chair, while Luna positioned herself on the rug at the child's feet. Electrodes were placed on Emma's temples and chest, non-invasive sensors designed to measure heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormone levels throughout the session. Emma had been curious rather than frightened by the equipment, which Sarah had explained as special stickers that help us know how you're feeling. "Is it going to hurt?" Emma had asked, her voice carrying a caution that suggested she'd learned to fear even benign medical procedures. "Not at all," Dr. Santos had assured her. "They're just little listeners that tell us when you're feeling calm and when you're feeling worried. That's all." Once Emma was comfortable, Dr. Santos had begun the session with simple conversation. "Emma, I'm Dr. Santos. I want to talk with you about the day that you got hurt, but you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. You can tell me to stop anytime. Okay?" Emma had looked at Luna, her small hand reaching down to touch the dog's soft ear. Luna had remained perfectly still, but her eyes had tracked Emma's movement with complete attention. "Okay," Emma had whispered. What followed was remarkable, as Dr. Santos had asked gentle questions. "What do you remember about the park? Tell me about that day. Can you remember the sound?" Emma had spoken, not in full sentences but in fragments and whispers, and as she'd spoken, her vital signs had remained remarkably stable. The monitoring equipment had shown what Sarah and Dr. Santos had hoped for. Emma's heart rate stayed between 85-95 beats per minute, elevated due to the emotional content of her words, but not the dangerous spike that would have indicated severe distress. Her blood pressure remained normal. Most significantly, the cortisol readings showed that while Emma's stress hormone levels did increase as she discussed the accident, they remained manageable, not the overwhelming surge that would trigger her body's full fight-or-flight response. And whenever Emma's stress levels began to climb, whenever the memories seemed too overwhelming, Luna would shift slightly, would press her head gently against Emma's leg, and Emma's vital signs would normalize almost immediately. "The truck was loud," Emma had said at one point, her voice barely audible. "It went beep, 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 and then I couldn't breathe." "That must have been very scary," Dr. Santos had said softly. "My leg hurt really bad," Emma had continued. "And Mama was crying. I didn't like that Mama was crying." At that point, Maria, who'd been observing from behind a one-way glass, had begun weeping silently, understanding for the first time the depth of Emma's awareness during the accident. that her daughter hadn't just experienced physical pain, but had also absorbed her mother's emotional anguish. By the end of that first intensive session, Emma had spoken approximately 200 words, not a flood, but a torrent compared to the complete silence of the past 3 months. She'd recounted specific details: the color of the truck, the feeling of the impact, the hospital lights, her inability to sleep, her nightmares about wheels and trucks and loud noises. Most importantly, she'd spoken without becoming completely. Her nervous system hadn't short-circuited. Her trauma response hadn't overwhelmed her capability to communicate. Over the next 14 days, Emma and Luna had 7 more sessions. Each one had been carefully designed and meticulously documented. Sarah had brought specialized equipment, video recording devices, heart rate monitors, cortisol testing kits, to create a scientific record of Emma's progress. The data told a compelling story. Session 2, Emma spoke 400 words. Heart rate remained stable. She discussed her fears about trucks and loud noises. Session 3, Emma began describing her recovery process. She spoke about physical therapy, about learning to walk again. Most significantly, she spoke about her fears for the future. Would she walk normally? Would she ever feel safe at the park again? Session 4, Emma made a breakthrough. She began asking questions about the truck driver, about justice, about consequences. "Is the bad man going to jail?" she'd asked. Maria and Carlos, listening from behind the glass, had exchanged looks of profound emotion. Their daughter was not just processing trauma, she was developing an understanding of accountability. By Session 5, Dr. Santos had noticed that Emma no longer needed to touch Luna constantly to remain calm. The dog's presence was sufficient. Emma had become confident enough to sit beside Luna without maintaining physical contact, though she still reached down periodically to reassure herself that the dog was there. "This is remarkable progress," Dr. Santos had told Sarah between sessions. "I've never seen a child move through trauma processing this quickly and effectively." The difference between Emma's sessions with Luna and her previous therapy attempts is night and day. During the later sessions, as Emma's confidence grew, so did the content of her narrative. She began describing specific details that had been buried in her traumatized mind: the exact position she'd been standing when the truck reversed, the specific sound it had made, the color of the butterfly she'd been chasing, the face of the park maintenance worker who'd helped her. These details were exactly what prosecutors needed. But more importantly, Emma was reclaiming her story. She was taking the trauma that had silenced her and transforming it into narrative, into words, into testimony, into power. By Session 7, Emma had spoken over 3,000 words across all the sessions combined. Her heart rate remained stable during discussions of the accident. Her cortisol levels, while elevated during trauma narratives, returned to baseline quickly. Most significantly, her eating had returned to normal. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost. Her nightmares had decreased from nearly every night to only 2 or 3 per week. And her walking had improved dramatically. She no longer limped noticeably. Her left leg, though still slightly weaker than her right, had regained functional capability. "Luna's done more for Emma in 2 weeks than I accomplished in 3 months of traditional therapy," Dr. Santos had admitted during a consultation meeting with Sarah and the parents. "There's something about this dog, something that Emma's brain recognizes as safe in a way it doesn't recognize me or other human therapists." By the final session, Emma and Luna had developed a bond that transcended the merely professional. They sat together with the comfortable ease of old companions, Emma leaning against Luna's side, her small fingers running through the dog's fur as she spoke about her hopes for the future. "I want to tell the judge," Emma had said quietly. "I want to tell everyone what happened, so that the bad man knows I'm not scared anymore." Sarah had felt tears in her eyes as she documented that statement. Emma had made the choice herself. Without pressure, without coercion, Emma had decided she was ready to testify, and Luna had given her the courage to make that choice. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back rows. The defendant, truck driver James, sat rigidly beside his attorney, anxious and defensive. Emma entered slowly, Luna beside her, calmly walking in perfect heel position. Emma was sworn in on a lowered Bible, her small hand trembling. The prosecutor began gently asking questions. Emma's voice wavered initially, recounting the park, the sunshine chasing butterflies, building the narrative. Then came the truck. Her voice strengthened as she described the terrible sound, the crushing pressure, the explosion of pain. Whenever her narrative faltered, she reached down and touched Luna's head. The dog's presence became her anchor. Emma described her nightmare months, her inability to speak, her lingering terror. The courtroom held its collective breath, hanging on every word from this courageous child. The morning of Emma's testimony arrived with the weight of historical significance. Every major news outlet in Ohio had picked up the story. 3-year-old to testify with police dog. The story had captured the public imagination in a way that most legal proceedings never did. People understood narratives of injustice, trauma, and hope. People understood the redemptive power of an animal's unconditional love. The courthouse hallways were crowded by 8:30 a.m. Journalists with cameras and microphones crowded the entrance, held back by courthouse security. Sarah had arranged for the family to enter through a side entrance to avoid the media circus. Emma held Luna's leash in one hand and her mother's hand in the other, looking remarkably calm, despite the institutional surroundings. "You remember what we talked about?" Sarah had asked Emma that morning before they left for the courthouse, "about telling your story to the judge and the people in the courtroom." Emma had nodded solemnly. She'd become accustomed to the idea over the past 2 weeks. The intensive therapy sessions had prepared her not just psychologically, but mentally. She understood that she had a job to do, that her words mattered, that this moment would determine whether the man who'd hurt her would face consequences. "And Luna will be there with you?" Emma had asked, though they'd rehearsed this a dozen times. "Luna will be right beside you," Sarah had confirmed. "The whole time you won't be alone." Emma had seemed satisfied with that answer. The main courtroom was indeed packed. Judge Martinez had made the unusual decision to allow media coverage of the testimony, not cameras, but written press, believing that transparency about this innovative approach to child testimony would serve the greater good. The courtroom gallery was filled with lawyers, law students, social workers, child psychologists, and journalists. What had begun as a local story was turning into a national conversation about how the legal system could better serve traumatized child witnesses. James sat at the defense table, his face a study in conflicted emotions. His attorney, a seasoned defense lawyer named Robert, had counseled him that the best approach was to remain composed and professional. But's eyes kept drifting toward Emma as she was led to the witness stand. The judge had arranged special accommodations. The witness stand had been lowered so that Emma could sit comfortably, her eye level approximately at the judge's. A cushioned chair had been provided instead of the standard hard bench. Most controversially, Luna had been permitted to position herself on the floor immediately adjacent to the witness stand, close enough for Emma to touch the dog, but positioned so as not to interfere with the proceedings or distract the judge and jury. As Emma was being situated, she looked nervous for the first time since arriving at the courthouse. Her small hands trembled slightly. Her breathing became shallow. Judge Martinez, recognizing the signs of pre-testimony anxiety, leaned forward. "Emma, do you see Luna?" the judge asked gently. Emma looked down at the dog and nodded. "Luna is going to be right here the entire time you're talking. If you feel scared or overwhelmed, you can reach down and touch her anytime you need to. Okay?" Emma nodded again, seeming to draw strength from the dog's steady presence. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer, approached with a demeanor that had been carefully calibrated through consultations with Dr. Santos. She was warm but professional, maternal but not patronizing. She carried a small basket of props, a photograph of the park, a toy truck similar to the one that had hit Emma, a small butterfly figurine. "Emma, I'm Ms. I'm here to ask you some questions about what happened to you. Is that okay?" "Okay," Emma replied, her voice small but audible throughout the courtroom. "Can you tell me what day you went to Riverside Park with your mom?" Emma had hesitated, and Sarah could see her reaching down to touch Luna's head. The dog's ears perked up slightly, a sign that Luna was consciously attuned to Emma's emotional state. "It was a sunny day," Emma had begun. "Mama brought sandwiches and juice boxes. We went to play." "What were you playing, Emma?" "Butterflies. I was chasing butterflies. They were orange and black." As Emma spoke, her confidence had grown incrementally. She described the park in detail, the basketball courts, the teenagers playing, the maintenance worker, the elderly couple. She was painting a picture of a normal, happy afternoon. Then Ms. had shown Emma the toy truck. "Emma, do you see this toy truck? Can you tell me about the truck at the park?" Emma's hand had immediately gone to Luna's head. She'd pressed her small fingers into the dog's fur, and Sarah had watched Luna's entire body relax deliberately, a trained response indicating to Emma, "I'm here. You're safe." "The truck was big," Emma had said, her voice suddenly very small. "It was white, and it had a beeping sound." "What happened when the truck beeped, Emma?" There had been a long silence. The entire courtroom had held its breath. Even the judge, who typically maintained judicial impassivity, had leaned forward with evident compassion. "I was chasing the butterfly," Emma had said slowly, "and I didn't hear Mama calling me. The truck came back. It went beep, beep, beep. And then—" Emma had paused, her small face scrunching with the effort of recalling traumatic memory. "And then it hit me," she'd continued. "I fell down. I felt like squishing, like the truck was on top of me. It hurt really, really bad." In the gallery, Maria had begun weeping quietly. Carlos had held her hand, his own eyes glistening. "Where did it hurt, Emma?" "My leg," Emma had pointed to her left leg. "The truck was on my leg and I couldn't move, and I was scared." "What were you scared of, Emma?" "I was scared I was going to die. I was scared Mama was going to be sad forever. I was scared the truck was going to squish me more." The raw honesty of a 3-year-old's fear had reverberated through the courtroom. Several observers, including members of the jury, had been visibly emotional. Ms. had continued with methodical gentleness, establishing medical facts through Emma's testimony. Emma had described the ambulance, the hospital, the pain during recovery. She'd spoken about not being able to talk, about her nightmares, about being afraid of trucks and loud noises. "Emma, how many months did you not talk?" Ms. had asked. 3 months, Emma had replied. "A long time. I couldn't say words. My mouth wouldn't work." "But you can talk now. What helped you start talking again?" Emma had looked at Luna and her small face had softened. Luna helped me. When I touched Luna, my words came back." That statement, simple, profound, and utterly genuine, had been the emotional centerpiece of the testimony. Several jurors had wiped away tears. Even Judge Martinez had paused, visibly moved. The testimony had lasted 90 minutes, an extraordinarily long time for a 3-year-old to maintain focus and emotional control. But Emma had done it. With Luna's silent presence and unconditional support, she had recounted her trauma with a coherence and emotional honesty that no jury could dismiss. When Ms. had finally said, "Thank you, Emma. I have no further questions," the courtroom had erupted in a strange emotional tension, not quite applause, which would have been inappropriate, but a palpable sense of profound respect for the child who had just. Robert, the defense attorney, had approached carefully. He'd known that aggressive cross-examination would be disastrous for his client's image. Instead, he'd simply confirmed a few facts that his client had already admitted, that hadn't seen Emma, that the accident had been unintentional, that he'd called 911 immediately. Emma had asked, his tone respectful. "Do you think Mr. tried to hurt you on purpose?" Emma had looked at James for the first time, really looked at him. Then she'd shaken her head slowly. "No," she'd said simply, "he didn't see me." It was a moment of extraordinary grace. A traumatized child offering an objective assessment, not exonerating the defendant's negligence, but acknowledging his lack of malicious intent. When Emma had been finally dismissed from the witness stand, she'd stood on slightly shaky legs. Luna had immediately risen from her position and positioned herself directly against the child's left side, providing physical stability and emotional grounding as Emma made her way down from the stand. The courtroom had watched this small child and the German Shepherd exit, and in that moment something shifted in the hearts of everyone present. They'd witnessed not just legal testimony but human transformation. They'd seen a child take back her voice, reclaim her narrative, and face her fear. As Emma's testimony concluded, something unexpected unfolded. James sat motionless, tears streaming down his weathered face. For months he'd minimized the accident, told himself Emma would recover fine, blamed lawyers for exaggeration. But hearing this small child describe months of suffering, nightmares, and persistent fear shattered his denial completely. His attorney began to cross-examine but stood abruptly, interrupting his own defense. "I want to plead guilty," he announced. The courtroom erupted in gasps. He turned directly toward Emma. "I'm so sorry, I see you now. I understand what I did." He accepted all prosecution demands. Then he addressed Emma's parents, his voice breaking, offering genuine remorse that transcended legal proceedings. His transformation seemed almost spiritual. Even Emma's prosecutors appeared moved by the unexpected confession and heartfelt apology to the child. James had come to court that morning prepared for battle. His attorney, Robert, had counseled him extensively on maintaining composure, on presenting himself as a sympathetic figure, a man who'd made an honest mistake, had spent months in therapy working on his narrative, learning to frame the incident in ways that emphasized his lack of culpability. He'd convinced himself, through a kind of psychological sleight of hand, that Emma's injuries probably weren't that severe, that children were resilient, that the legal system was overreacting to what had been an unfortunate but ultimately forgivable accident. Then Emma had taken the witness stand. At first, had tried to maintain emotional distance. He'd listened to Emma's testimony about the park, the butterflies, the sunshine with a kind of detached professionalism. It was easier to think about these details abstractly, to process them as testimony rather than as the lived experience of a real child. But as Emma had described the impact like squishing, her small voice had said, something had cracked in carefully constructed psychological defense. She described her leg being crushed. She described the pain. She described the terror of thinking she might die. And then she described the silence, 3 months of silence, the inability to speak, the nightmares. Had felt his chest tightening as Emma spoke. He'd wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He'd been compelled by the force of her testimony, by the raw authenticity of a child recounting genuine trauma. This wasn't exaggeration. This wasn't legal theatrics. This was a 3-year-old girl describing the worst moments of her life, moments that he, James, had caused. The weight of that realization had pressed down on his chest with physical force. When Emma had described not being able to talk, had seen something shift in her demeanor. Her eyes had found Luna and the dog had responded, and Emma had seemed to gather strength. She'd continued speaking about her recovery, about her fears, about learning to trust the world again. And had found tears streaming down his face, tears he couldn't suppress. Tears that came from somewhere deep inside him, where he'd been storing denial and rationalization and self-protection. By the time Emma had finished her testimony and described Luna as the entity that had helped her find her voice, had been openly weeping. His attorney had placed a hand on his arm, probably intending to be grounding, but it felt like restraint. Robert had stood up to begin the cross-examination. He'd approached with measured steps, his voice carefully modulated. "Emma, Mr. here," had begun, gesturing toward his client. That's when it stood up. "I want to stop," he'd said abruptly, his voice thick with emotion. Robert had looked at him with surprise and something like alarm. "James, sit down. We'll talk about this." "No," had interrupted, and then he'd done something his attorney had explicitly told him never to do. He'd addressed the court directly without permission. "Your Honor, I want to plead guilty to everything. I don't want a trial. I don't want a defense." Judge Martinez had remained composed, though Sarah could see the shock in her eyes from where she sat in the gallery. "Mister, I strongly advise you to speak with your attorney before making any statements to this court," the judge had said. But had shaken his head, and then he'd done something even more extraordinary. He'd stood up and turned directly toward Emma. "Emma," he'd said, and his voice had been raw, stripped of pretense and self-protection. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't see you. I didn't understand what I did to you, but I understand now. I hear you. I see what I caused." Maria had made a sound like a sob breaking through her carefully maintained composure. Carlos had wrapped his arms around his wife more tightly. "I'm going to plead guilty," had continued, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "I'm going to take responsibility for what I did, and I'm going to spend whatever time it takes to understand the gravity of my actions. You didn't deserve this. You were just a little girl chasing butterflies, and I took that from you. I took your voice. I took your sense of safety, and I am profoundly, deeply sorry." The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence. This wasn't how legal proceedings typically unfolded. Defense attorneys didn't allow their clients to confess. Defendants didn't voluntarily surrender their right to defend themselves. Judge Martinez had called for a brief recess to meet with both attorneys and in her chambers. Sarah, watching from the gallery, had understood that the judge needed to ensure was making this decision with full understanding of its implications, that his confession wouldn't be later challenged as coerced or made under duress. When they'd returned, had formally entered a guilty plea to all charges, but before the judge could proceed with sentencing considerations, had requested one more opportunity to address the court. "Your Honor, with the permission of this court, I'd like to address the family," he'd said. Judge Martinez had glanced at the prosecutors, who'd nodded their agreement. She gestured for to proceed. What had followed was something that transcended typical courtroom procedure. Had stepped down from the defense table and had stood, facing the family directly. His body language was open and vulnerable, hands visible, shoulders slightly curved inward in a posture of submission. "Maria and Carlos," he'd begun, addressing them by their first names with the intimacy of genuine remorse. "I took something from your family that I can never give back. I took your daughter's childhood innocence. I took her ability to feel safe in the world. I took months of your lives, your sleep, your peace, your sense of security as parents. And I did it because I wasn't paying attention. I was tired and impatient and careless, and a child paid the price for my negligence." His voice had broken multiple times, and he'd had to pause to collect himself. "I'm going to cooperate fully with the prosecution. I'm going to accept whatever sentence this court deems appropriate. But I also want you to know that I am going to dedicate myself to understanding what I've done and to becoming someone who never makes this mistake again. Whether that means anything to you, I don't know. But I need you to know that I see what happened. I see what I caused. And I am genuinely, profoundly sorry." Then, in a gesture that seemed to come from somewhere authentic within him, had turned to Emma. "And Emma," he'd said, his eyes wet with tears, "I'm sorry that a truck driver's carelessness took your voice, but I'm so glad you found your voice again. I'm so glad Luna helped you. You're brave and strong, and you shouldn't have had to be tested the way you were. But you are remarkable, and I hope one day when you're old enough to understand that you can know that I was wrong and that I'm sorry and that I understand the gravity of what I did." The courtroom had erupted, not in celebration, but in a strange collective emotional release. Several jurors were openly weeping. Members of the media were scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Even Judge Martinez had paused for a moment before proceeding, her judicial composure momentarily overcome. Maria had begun sobbing, not angry sobs, but cleansing sobs that seemed to acknowledge that, while nothing could undo what had happened, there was something redemptive in this man's acknowledgement of his culpability. Carlos had held his wife, tears streaming down his own face. And Emma, from her position in the witness area where she was being held by one of the court officers, had simply watched with the kind of clear-eyed evaluation that only children seemed capable of achieving. She hadn't forgiven him. Forgiveness was beyond the scope of a 3-year-old's emotional capacity. But she'd seen him, truly seen him in his remorse and his humanity. Judge Martinez had called for another recess to process what had just occurred. The sentencing would proceed, but the nature of the case had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer about punishment and retribution. This was about accountability, responsibility, and the possibility of genuine human transformation. As had been led from the courtroom, he looked back one more time at Emma. And Emma had reached down and touched Luna's head, not as a gesture toward, but as a grounding gesture for herself. A reminder that she was safe, that she was supported, that she would be okay. 6 months later, Emma laughed while playing tag with classmates, her injuries healed, her spirit restored. The Ohio court system, inspired by this extraordinary case, launched an unprecedented initiative, Luna's Law, allowing certified therapy dogs to assist traumatized child witnesses statewide. Detective Sarah became the program director, training handlers and dogs specifically for courtroom support. Luna became Ohio's most famous police dog, featured in national media. Emma and Luna maintained their special bond, meeting monthly for therapy sessions as Emma continued healing. James, having served his sentence, dedicated himself to advocating for pedestrian safety in schools statewide. The accident that nearly destroyed a life instead sparked systemic change, healing, and unexpected redemption. One small dog had transformed tragedy into hope, proving that sometimes the most powerful courtroom testimony comes from an animal's silent, unconditional love for a broken child. The Christmas morning 6 months after Emma's testimony arrived cold and crystalline, the kind of December day in Columbus that made the world feel like a postcard. Emma stood at the living room window of her family's apartment, pressing her small nose against the glass, watching snow fall in delicate patterns. She wore a red and green dress that her grandmother had sent, and her hair was tied up in ribbons that matched. "Mama, look, it's snowing," she called out, her voice carrying the unmodified joy of a child who'd reclaimed the right to simple happiness. Maria emerged from the kitchen, flour on her hands from the tamale preparations they'd begun that morning. She pulled Emma into a tight hug, and Sarah, who was sitting on the couch with a cup of hot chocolate, watched this ordinary moment with extraordinary appreciation. The family had invited Sarah and Luna to spend Christmas morning with them, a gesture that had initially surprised Sarah, but that she'd quickly understood as an expression of gratitude that transcended words. Luna sat contentedly on a cushion near the fireplace, her golden eyes tracking Emma's movements with the attentiveness of a guardian spirit. "She's doing remarkably well," Sarah had reported to Dr. Santos just the week before. "Nightmares have decreased to perhaps once a month. Her eating is completely normal. She's returned to preschool and has made new friends. Physically, there's no discernible limp anymore. The psychological integration seems nearly complete." "And the bond with Luna?" Dr. Santos had asked. "Unbreakable," Sarah had replied. "They've become extensions of each other. Emma seeks Luna out when she's stressed, and Luna seems to have an almost prescient understanding of Emma's emotional needs. It's remarkable to witness." That morning, after gifts had been opened, Emma received a large stuffed German shepherd that she'd immediately named. Little Luna Carlos had pulled Sarah aside into the kitchen. "We wanted to tell you something," he'd said, Maria joining him at the kitchen table. The prosecutors have asked Emma if she'd be willing to participate in a documentary about her case. They want to create something for educational purposes, to show other courts, other prosecutors, other families how this kind of therapeutic intervention can work. Sarah had felt her chest tighten. What did you tell them? We told them we'd only do it if you and Luna were part of it, Maria had said. Because none of this happens without you two, without your belief that there had to be a better way. That conversation had turned into something larger, a series of meetings with state legislators, with the Ohio Supreme Court, with victim advocacy organizations. The documentary project had evolved into something unprecedented, Luna's Law. The legislation had been officially proposed in February, just months after sentencing. The bill, named after Luna, would establish a statewide program allowing certified therapy dogs to assist child and vulnerable adult witnesses in legal proceedings. The framework would include rigorous training standards for therapy dogs specifically designed for courtroom support, professional certification for handlers working with trauma-affected witnesses, psychological evaluation protocols to determine which cases would benefit from animal-assisted testimony support, protections ensuring that the dog's presence wouldn't prejudice the court proceedings, accessibility across Ohio's judiciary system, not just in Columbus. Sarah had been recruited to lead the program. The offer had come from the state's Attorney General himself during a formal meeting in his office. They wanted her expertise, her documentation of Luna's effectiveness, her credibility within law enforcement and the judiciary. I'll do it on one condition, Sarah had told him. Luna continues working cases. This isn't about Luna becoming a symbol or a mascot. She's a working therapy animal, and that's where her impact is most authentic. Agreed, the Attorney General had said without hesitation. By the end of 2025, Luna's Law had become a reality. 6 therapy dogs had been trained and certified to work in Ohio courts. Sarah had developed a comprehensive training program based on the protocols she'd established with Luna. The program received funding from both the state and from private donors who'd been moved by Emma's story. More importantly, it was working. In the first 6 months of Luna's Law's implementation, 4 other traumatized child witnesses had with canine support. 3 of those cases had resulted in guilty pleas, similar to's. The 4th case had gone to trial, and the jury had convicted the defendant based significantly on the child's testimony that might not have been possible without the emotional grounding provided by a therapy dog. News outlets had covered Luna extensively. National media had picked up the story. Luna had appeared on morning television shows, had been featured in major news magazines, had become the face of a movement toward more compassionate approaches to child testimony. But Sarah had been careful to ensure that Luna remained grounded in her actual work, therapy, comfort, presence, rather than becoming a celebrity disconnected from her purpose. James had been sentenced to 3 years in prison, with 5 years of supervised probation following his release. But his transformation had continued to deepen. He'd spent his first year of incarceration participating in every rehabilitation program available. He'd written letters of apology to the family, not to manipulate or pressure them, but as part of his genuine process of accountability. They'd never responded, and Sarah knew they didn't owe him a response, but the letters had been received with sadness rather than anger. During his 2nd year of incarceration, had applied for participation in a restorative justice program. The family had been invited to participate if they chose to, but Sarah had encouraged them not to feel obligated. To her surprise, they'd expressed willingness. The restorative justice meeting had occurred in a specialized mediation room at the prison, a space designed to facilitate difficult conversations between perpetrators and victims. Emma hadn't attended, which Sarah had thought was wise. Emma was a child who'd already done more emotional labor than any child should ever have to do. But Maria and Carlos had attended, and afterward, Maria had told Sarah something that had moved her deeply. He's truly sorry, not legally sorry, not strategically sorry, actually sorry. We can't forgive what he did. What he did to Emma will affect her whole life. But we can see that he's genuinely trying to become someone different. That's something. Had been released after serving 30 months. He'd fulfilled his attorney's concern that a guilty plea would result in harsh sentencing, but he'd accepted that as the appropriate consequence of his actions. Upon release, he'd moved to a different part of Ohio and had begun working with a pedestrian safety advocacy organization. He'd given presentations at schools about the importance of paying attention while driving, about the devastating consequences of negligence. He never mentioned Emma by name. Privacy protection for the child was paramount. But his message was clear. Carelessness can destroy lives. Responsibility matters. Consequences are real. Emma, meanwhile, had thrived. By the following spring, she'd started kindergarten and had adjusted beautifully. She still had occasional moments of anxiety around trucks and loud noises, which was perfectly normal given her trauma history. But she had tools to manage those moments. She had Luna for support. She had parents who understood her needs. She had a therapist in Dr. Santos who she still saw monthly. Most importantly, she had her voice. She had reclaimed the right to speak, to tell her story, to be heard. The monthly sessions with Luna had become a ritual, not because Emma needed intensive therapy anymore, but because the bond between girl and dog had become essential to both of them. Emma would update Luna on her week at school, on her friendships, on her growing confidence. Luna would simply be present, offering the unconditional acceptance that had become the foundation of Emma's emotional recovery. On an ordinary Tuesday in late spring, Emma had asked her mother a question that had made Maria weep. "Mama, can I thank Luna for helping me find my words?" Maria had said yes, and Emma had spent 30 minutes with Luna that afternoon simply holding the dog, stroking her fur, whispering gratitude that a 3-year-old wasn't expected to articulate, but that Luna seemed to understand completely. Sarah had documented it all, not for the media but for the record. For future cases, future children, future dogs. Luna's law had only just begun, and the possibilities seemed limitless. But more than statistics or legislation or systemic change, what mattered most was this. A little girl who'd been silenced by trauma had found her voice again. And in finding her voice, she'd not only reclaimed her own power but had sparked a movement that would help countless other traumatized children find theirs. One dog, one child, one moment of connection, and a world that was forever changed. Luna's story, and Emma's story, would echo through Ohio's courtrooms for decades to come. They would inspire other states to develop similar programs. They would demonstrate to a skeptical legal system that compassion and effectiveness weren't mutually exclusive. They would prove that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes wrapped in fur and unconditional love. And most importantly, they would remind the world that healing is possible. That trauma doesn't have to be permanent. That sometimes, in the darkest moments, salvation arrives on 4 paws and a wagging tail. The end.